Divorce. The word tastes bitter in my mouth, like burnt coffee on a winter morning. I stare at the legal documents spread across my mahogany desk, the same desk where I'd spent countless nights building someone else's empire. The irony isn't lost on me. I'm finally signing papers that will make me visible again in a room where I'd been invisible for 20 years. The autumn rain patters against the floor to ceiling windows of my corner office. 2 years ago, I didn't even have an office. 2 years ago, I was Margaret Whitman Sterling, the perfect wife who helped from the shadows. Today, I'm Margaret Whitman, CEO of Whitman Consulting Group, and the signature I'm about to place will erase the Sterling forever. My phone buzzes. A text from Richard. Please reconsider. I know I don't deserve another chance, but our family. I delete the message without finishing it. Some bridges aren't meant to be rebuilt, no matter how prettily you paint the ashes. Flashback 20 years earlier. The beginning, I was 28 when I met Richard Sterling at a business conference in Chicago. Fresh out of Northwestern with my MBA, full of dreams about changing the corporate world. He was charming in that effortless way that comes with generational wealth, the kind of confidence money buys from birth. You're brilliant, he told me over dinner at some overpriced steakhouse. I've never met anyone who understands market dynamics like you do. I believed him. God help me, I believed every word. We married 18 months later. His mother Victoria made it clear from the engagement party that I was marrying into something bigger than myself, the Sterling legacy, built over 3 generations of Chicago business elite. Richard needs someone to complement his natural talents, she'd said, adjusting my veil with manicured fingers. Someone to help him reach his full potential. I thought she meant as his equal. I was wrong. Flashback, the Miller account. 3 months before. The conference room at Sterling Consulting buzzed with tension. Richard sat at the head of the table, his usual spot, while I occupied my customary chair 3 seats down, close enough to provide support, far enough to remain unnoticed. The Miller Industries account, Richard announced, is the biggest opportunity we've had in 5 years. Whoever lands this gets us into the Fortune 500 conversation. I'd already spent 6 weeks researching Miller Industries, their supply chain vulnerabilities, their expansion plans into Southeast Asia, their CEO's Harvard Business School thesis on sustainable manufacturing. I knew Miller Industries better than some of their own board members. Margaret, Richard turned to me with that practiced smile. You'll handle the preliminary research, won't you? Just the background stuff. I'll take care of strategy. Background stuff. 20 years of marriage, and he still called my comprehensive market analysis background stuff. I remember when we were newlyweds, Richard would at least say, we developed this strategy when presenting my work. By year 5, it became, my research indicates. By year 10, I disappeared from the narrative entirely. The erosion was so gradual, so perfectly orchestrated, that I barely noticed until I was already gone. Victoria nodded approvingly from her seat by the window. At 73, she still attended every major meeting, her presence a reminder that this was her dynasty first, Richard's company second, and my contribution never. Excellent, she said. Richard, your father would be so proud of how you've grown the business. Grown. As if the 340% revenue increase over the past decade had happened through natural evolution rather than the strategic overhauls I designed and implemented while Richard played golf at Medina Country Club. The birthday that changed everything. I should have known something was wrong when Richard suggested I treat myself to a nice dinner on my 50th birthday. You deserve some me time, he'd said that morning, already dressed in his best suit, odd for a Wednesday when he usually worked from home. Why don't you go to that French place you like? Make it special. 50. Half a century on this earth, and 20 years dedicated to building someone else's dream. I drove to Le Bernardin alone, ordering wine that cost more than most people spend on groceries, trying to convince myself that solitude on milestone birthdays was sophisticated, European, intentional. My mother called while I waited for dessert. Happy birthday, sweetheart. Are you celebrating with Richard? He's working late, I lied. Same lie I'd been telling for 2 decades. You know how it is. Your father and I were just saying how proud we are of what you've built. That business of yours is really taking off. My business. If only she knew. The drive home should have been peaceful. Early October in Winnetka. The trees just beginning their autumn show. The kind of evening that makes you grateful to live where seasons change. Instead, I felt hollow, like I'd spent 50 years becoming someone I didn't recognize. Then I saw the cars. Victoria's pearl white Mercedes. Catherine's Range Rover. Even Richard's college roommate's Tesla. People who hadn't visited in months suddenly lined our circular driveway like some automotive family reunion. Through our living room windows, I could see silhouettes moving, glasses raised, the warm glow of what looked suspiciously like a celebration. For a moment, just a moment, I thought they'd planned a surprise party. 20 years of marriage, and Richard had finally remembered. Finally decided I was worth celebrating. I parked at the end of the driveway, my hands shaking as I applied lipstick in the rearview mirror. 50 years old, dressed in my best black dress, walking toward what I hoped was recognition and feared was something else entirely. The front door opened before I could use my key. Catherine stood there, champagne flute in hand, her expression shifting from surprise to something like guilt. "Oh," she said, "you're home." The noise hit me like a physical force. Our living room transformed into a party I hadn't been invited to. A banner stretched across the fireplace. "Congratulations on the Miller account, Richard." The Miller account. My Miller account. 3 months of 18-hour days. My comprehensive strategy document. My relationship with their CFO built over dozens of carefully orchestrated lunches and coffee meetings. Richard stood in the center of it all, tie loosened, face flushed with champagne and praise. Victoria had her arm around his shoulders, beaming with maternal pride. To my brilliant son, she was saying, raising her glass, who single-handedly secured the biggest client in Sterling Consulting history. Single-handedly. The word echoed in my head like a slap. I thought of the Sunday afternoons I'd spent at the office while Richard watched football. The client dinners where I'd researched every topic of conversation to help him shine. The strategy presentations I'd written in their entirety, footnoting sources he'd never even read. Single-handedly. Margaret. Richard's voice cut through my thoughts. "You're just in time for the toast. Come celebrate with us." Celebrate. As if I were a guest at my own humiliation. Victoria's eyes met mine across the room, and for a moment, I saw something flicker there, not guilt, but calculation. She knew exactly what this was. What this had always been. "I thought you were at dinner," Richard continued, his voice carrying just enough volume for everyone to hear. "That little birthday thing you mentioned. That little birthday thing. My 50th birthday, reduced to an inconvenient scheduling conflict. It was lovely," I managed, my voice steady despite the earthquake happening in my chest. "I'm glad you're all here to celebrate Richard's achievement." I'd learned to speak in code over the years. Wives of successful men develop their own language, words that sound supportive but carry the weight of everything left unsaid. "Of course we are," Victoria said, finally releasing Richard from her maternal embrace. "Family celebrates family. Though I have to say, we're all quite curious about this mysterious dinner. Anyone special?" The question landed like a perfectly aimed dart. In a room full of people, Victoria had managed to make me feel both invisible and exposed simultaneously. "Just me," I said, celebrating another year of growth. Richard laughed, that easy laugh that had charmed me 22 years ago. My wife and her philosophical phases. "Come on, honey, grab some champagne. We're toasting the future of Sterling Consulting." The future of Sterling Consulting. Built on foundations I'd poured, with strategies I developed, using relationships I'd cultivated. I accepted a glass from the server, another detail I hadn't noticed, the professional catering for the party I wasn't invited to, and raised it with the rest of them. "To Richard," I said, meeting his eyes across the room. "For taking what he needed." The words hung in the air just long enough for him to hear the double meaning, but not long enough for anyone else to catch it. 20 years of marriage teaches you precision. The moment of clarity, I excused myself 20 minutes later, claiming a headache that wasn't entirely fabricated. Upstairs in our bedroom, I sat on the edge of the bed we'd shared for 2 decades and stared at my reflection in the vanity mirror Richard's grandmother had left us. 50 years old. Silver threading through my dark hair, laugh lines around my eyes that had deepened not from joy, but from years of smiling through gritted teeth. I looked like someone's successful wife, someone's supportive mother figure, someone's invisible backbone. But I didn't look like me. I remembered the young woman who'd graduated summa cum laude from Northwestern, who'd had 3 job offers before she even walked across the stage. Where had she gone? When had I traded her ambitions for Richard's, her name for his, her visibility for his success? The party continued downstairs, voices growing louder with each round of champagne. I could hear Richard telling the Miller story, my story, with the practiced ease of someone who convinced himself it was true. The key, he was saying, was understanding their supply chain vulnerabilities in the Southeast Asian market. Once I identified the bottlenecks, the solution became obvious. Supply chain vulnerabilities. I'd spent 2 weeks in Vietnam and Thailand, interviewing factory managers and logistics coordinators, building the foundation for what would become our winning strategy. Bottlenecks. I'd created a 40-page analysis of regulatory constraints across 6 countries, complete with recommendations for compliance frameworks. The solution became obvious. To him, maybe. To me, it had required 3 months of 16-hour days and expertise I'd built over 20 years of invisible labor. I pulled out my laptop and opened the Miller file. Page after page of my work, my analysis, my insights. Research that would have cost Sterling Consulting 6 figures if they'd hired an outside firm. Strategy that would generate millions in revenue over the next 5 years. All credited to Richard Sterling's single-handed brilliance. My phone buzzed. A text from Diana, my college roommate who'd somehow managed to remain both successful and visible in her own career. Happy birthday. Hope Richard spoiled you rotten. How does it feel to be 50 and fabulous? I stared at the message for a long time before typing back. Fabulous isn't the word I'd use. Her response came immediately. Oh, call me. Instead, I opened a new document on my laptop and began typing. 20 years ago, I made a choice. I chose partnership over ambition, collaboration over competition, Richard's success over my own visibility. I told myself it was love. I told myself it was marriage. I told myself it was building something together. Tonight, I realized it was none of those things. It was erasure, methodical and complete. I've been the architect of someone else's empire for 2 decades. Time to build my own. I saved the document and closed the laptop. Downstairs, the party was winding down, guests beginning their champagne fuzzy departures. Soon Richard would come upstairs, flush with praise and ready to share the details of his triumph. Our triumph, he'd probably say. We did it, Margaret. But we hadn't. I had. And it was time everyone knew it. The plan takes shape at Diana's apartment. Show me everything. Diana's apartment in Lincoln Park felt like stepping into an alternate universe where women my age were allowed to take up space. Books stacked on every surface, plants thriving in southern-facing windows, artwork from her travels covering the walls. No masculine approval required. She'd arrived at my house within an hour of my text, helped me pack 2 suitcases and a box of files while Richard held court downstairs. We'd walked out the front door like ghosts, invisible as always. Start with the Miller account, she said, settling onto her couch with coffee and the laptop I'd carried away from 20 years of invisible labor. Walk me through everything. Diana and I had been roommates at Northwestern, study partners who dreamed of changing the business world together. She'd kept her name when she married, kept her career when she divorced, kept her edge when the world tried to dull it. I'd envied her for years without admitting it, even to myself. Miller Industries was hemorrhaging money in their Southeast Asian operations. I began, opening the files that represented 3 months of my life. Regulatory compliance failures, supply chain bottlenecks, vendor relationship management issues. And Richard knew this how? He didn't. I spent 2 weeks in Vietnam and Thailand, interviewed 47 people across 6 facilities, documented everything. I pulled up the photographic evidence, factory floors, shipping manifests, regulatory documents in 3 languages. This isn't work you delegate to an assistant. Diana scrolled through the comprehensive analysis, her expression growing more incredulous with each page. Margaret, this is doctoral level research. How did Richard present this? PowerPoint slides. My 40-page analysis condensed into 12 bullet points he could memorize. I opened another file. Here's the presentation he gave to Miller's board. She read for several minutes before looking up. This is your work. Every insight, every recommendation, every piece of strategic thinking. Richard just delivered it? Richard has always been a good presenter, I said, hearing the defensive note in my voice that 20 years of marriage had trained into me. He's charismatic, confident. People listen to him. People listen to confidence, Margaret. But this? She gestured at the screen. This is brilliance. And brilliance doesn't require a translator. For 20 years, I'd told myself that Richard's role was equally important. He was the face of our partnership, the voice that commanded respect in rooms where women my age were still fighting for credibility. I'd convinced myself that visibility was less important than impact, that I was the strategic mind while he was the executive presence. But sitting in Diana's living room, looking at my work through her eyes, I saw it clearly for the first time. Richard wasn't translating my brilliance for an audience that couldn't hear women. He was stealing it. My phone had been buzzing constantly since we'd left. Richard, discovering my absence. Victoria, demanding explanations. Catherine, trying to play peacemaker. Let me guess, Diana said, watching me silence another call. They want to know where you went. They want to know where their work product went, I corrected. I took copies of everything, 20 years of strategy documents, client analyses, market research. Everything you created while legally entitled to access it as a key executive of the company. Key executive? I laughed bitterly. On paper, I'm Richard's wife who sometimes helps with projects, which makes their legal position even weaker if they try to claim intellectual property theft. Diana's expression was sharp with possibility. Margaret, do you realize what you have here? I looked at the files spread across her coffee table. 20 years of invisible labor, documented and categorized. Market analyses that had generated millions in revenue. Strategic frameworks that had transformed entire sectors of Sterling Consulting's business. Client relationships that had sustained the company through 3 economic downturns. All credited to Richard Sterling's leadership. I have proof, I said slowly, that I've been the actual brains behind Sterling Consulting for 20 years. You have more than proof, Diana said. You have ammunition, the counter strategy. We worked until 3 in the morning, mapping out 20 years of intellectual property theft with the precision of a military campaign. Diana had always been the strategist between us, the one who thought 3 moves ahead. Now she turned that analytical mind toward dismantling the empire I'd built for someone else. The Miller account is your smoking gun, she said, highlighting key passages in my research documentation. Everything is timestamped, every insight is sourced, every strategic recommendation has your digital fingerprint on it. But Richard's name is on the client contract. Richard's name is on the signature line. Your brain is in every clause. She pulled up the original proposal I'd drafted. Look at this, 47 pages of market analysis, competitive positioning, implementation timeline. Then look at this. She opened Richard's presentation to the Miller board. 12 slides, each one a watered-down summary of my comprehensive analysis. He didn't just take credit for your work, Margaret. He butchered it. And thank God he did, because now we can prove the original thinking was yours. Looking at the side-by-side comparison, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 20 years. Righteous anger. Not the quiet resentment I carried for 2 decades, but clean, clarifying fury. This wasn't about Richard being a good presenter or me being too modest. This was theft, systematic and deliberate. What about the other accounts? I asked. Diana grinned. Let's find out. We spent the next 4 hours documenting a pattern that made my stomach sick with recognition. The Patterson manufacturing turnaround, my supply chain redesign, credited to Richard's innovative thinking. The Hoffman Industries expansion into Latin America, my 6-month market research project, presented as Richard's strategic vision. Account after account, Year after year, my invisible labor transformed into Richard's visible success. 20 years, Diana said quietly, looking at the comprehensive evidence we'd assembled. 20 years of systematic intellectual property theft. My phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from Patricia, my assistant at Sterling Consulting. Mrs. Sterling, Mr. Sterling is looking for you. He seems upset about some missing files. I showed Diana the message. Richards figured out what I took. Good. Let him panic. Diana was typing rapidly on her own laptop. I'm reaching out to some people. What people? Jonathan Morrison, for one. Remember him? Richard's old rivalry from business school? I did remember Jonathan. Brilliant, competitive, the one person who'd ever made Richard feel intellectually inadequate. He'd started his own consulting firm 5 years ago, had been trying to break into Chicago's market ever since. He's been asking around about the real power structure at Sterling Consulting, Diana continued. Apparently, word gets around in our industry about who actually does the work. The idea that people might have always known, that I was the architect behind Richard's success was both terrifying and exhilarating. Terrifying because it meant my invisibility had been a choice, not a necessity. Exhilarating because it meant I wouldn't have to start from nothing. Diana, I can't what? Take credit for your own work? Build something with your own name on it? She closed her laptop and looked at me directly. Margaret, you're 50 years old. How much longer are you going to let Richard Sterling take bows for your brilliance? The question hung between us like a challenge. 50 years old. Half my life spent building someone else's legacy, half my potential buried under someone else's ambition. What would I even call it? I asked. Diana smiled. Whitman Consulting Group has a nice ring to it. The first move at Jonathan's office, Jonathan Morrison's office in the Loop, reflected everything Sterling Consulting wasn't: modern, efficient, and refreshingly free of generational portraits and antique furniture chosen to intimidate rather than welcome. Margaret, he said, standing as Diana and I entered his conference room. I have to admit, I've been hoping for this conversation for years. He was older than I remembered, silver threading through hair that had been dark brown in business school, but his eyes held the same sharp intelligence that had made Richard so competitive 22 years ago. You've been hoping to steal Richard's wife? I asked, settling into a chair that was comfortable rather than historic. Jonathan laughed. I've been hoping to work with the actual brains behind Sterling Consulting. Industry secret. We all know who really runs that company. The casual acknowledgement hit me like cold water. For 20 years, I'd assumed my invisibility was complete, that Richard's reputation as a strategic genius was unquestioned. To learn that people in our industry had been watching, recognizing, waiting. What exactly do you know? Diana asked. I know that Sterling Consulting's transformation over the past 15 years coincides exactly with Margaret's deeper involvement in strategic planning, Jonathan said, opening a folder on his desk. I know that their most innovative work, the supply chain overhauls, the international expansion strategies, the digital transformation frameworks, all bear the hallmarks of someone with Margaret's educational background and analytical style. He spread out what looked like a comparative analysis of Sterling Consulting's public-facing work and strategic methodologies. I also know, he continued, that Richard Sterling's pre-Margaret work was competent but unremarkable. Good client management, solid execution, nothing revolutionary. Then suddenly, around 2008, Sterling Consulting starts producing breakthrough strategies that put them in the Fortune 500 conversation. 2008, I said quietly. That's when Richard started asking me to review all major proposals. Review, Diana repeated. Interesting euphemism. Jonathan nodded. Margaret, I've been tracking your intellectual fingerprints for over a decade. Not because I'm obsessed with your husband's business, but because I recognize genius when I see it. And what Sterling Consulting has been producing. That's not Richard's genius. Intellectual fingerprints. The phrase gave me chills. For 20 years, I'd thought I was invisible, but apparently, I'd been leaving traces of myself in every strategy document, every market analysis, every innovative solution that had built Richard's reputation. Why didn't you ever say anything? I asked. To who? Richard? Jonathan's expression was wry. He's not going to admit he's been taking credit for his wife's work. To you? You seemed committed to staying in the background. To the industry. Without proof, it would have looked like professional jealousy. And now you're here, in my office, with what I assume is proof. He leaned forward. What do you want, Margaret? I looked at Diana, who nodded encouragingly, then back at Jonathan. I want to build something of my own. With the Miller account as your first client? How did you? Because I've been tracking the Miller situation for months. Richard's presentation to their board was competent but derivative, classic Richard Sterling execution of someone else's strategy. But the underlying research, the market analysis that drove their decision to expand into Southeast Asia, that was next level thinking. Jonathan opened another file. I reached out to Miller's CFO last week, casual conversation about industry trends. He mentioned being impressed by the deep strategic insight that Sterling Consulting had provided. Said it was the most comprehensive competitive analysis his company had ever received. Richard couldn't have produced that analysis. He'd never spent time in Southeast Asia, didn't speak the languages, had no relationships with the regulatory agencies I'd worked with for months. But somehow, in my mind, I'd still been giving him credit for presentation skills and client management. How long had I been making excuses for intellectual theft? The Miller account wants to expand the engagement, I told Jonathan. Additional markets, deeper strategic support. Richard's been telling them I'm under the weather to buy time. Because he can't deliver what you created. Because he doesn't understand what I created. Jonathan smiled. Perfect. Here's what I'm proposing. Whitman Consulting Group as a division of Morrison Strategic. You get complete autonomy, your own team, significant equity stake. I get the pleasure of watching Sterling Consulting collapse under the weight of its own incompetence. And the Miller account? We approach them directly. Show them who really developed their strategy. My phone buzzed with another text from Richard. We need to talk. The Miller presentation is next week. I showed the message to Jonathan, who grinned. How much time does he have to prepare? 5 days. And how much of your original research does he have access to? None of it. Everything's password protected, and I changed all the passwords before I left. Diana leaned back in her chair. This is going to be beautiful. The legal counterattack. By Thursday morning, Sterling Consulting's lawyers had fired their first shot. A cease and desist letter claiming that I'd violated my employment agreement by taking confidential business information. The irony was so thick I could have cut it with a knife. They're threatening to sue me for stealing my own work. I told Diana as we sat in Jonathan's conference room, reviewing the legal documents that had arrived by courier at 8 a.m. Jonathan's attorney, Sarah Chen, spread the papers across the table with the bemused expression of someone who'd seen many frivolous lawsuits, but rarely ones this self-defeating. This is actually helpful, she said, highlighting key passages. They're claiming you had no authority to access these strategic documents, while simultaneously acknowledging that the documents exist and were created during your time at Sterling Consulting. I don't understand. They can't have it both ways, Margaret. Either you were a key executive with legitimate access to strategic materials, in which case you had every right to copy your own work, or you were just Richard's wife who occasionally helped with projects, in which case these documents shouldn't exist in the first place. Diana laughed. They just admitted in writing that Margaret created strategic materials that were central to their business operations. More than that, Sarah continued, they're claiming that losing access to these materials threatens their ability to service existing clients. Which begs the question, if these are Richard's strategies, why can't he recreate them? For 20 years, I'd been terrified of legal consequences if I ever challenged Richard's version of our professional partnership. Now, watching his lawyers build a case that inadvertently proved my intellectual property claims, I realized that fear had been another form of control. What's our response? I asked. Sarah smiled. Countersuit for intellectual property theft with 20 years of documented evidence. She opened a folder containing the comprehensive analysis Diana and I had prepared, time-stamped documents, email trails, client correspondence, all proving a pattern of systematic credit theft. Margaret, this isn't just about the Miller account. This is about 2 decades of stolen intellectual property. Conservative estimate? We're talking about millions in damages. My phone rang. Victoria Sterling, calling for the first time since I'd left her son's celebration party. Answer it, Sarah advised. But put it on speaker. Margaret, Victoria's voice carried that crisp authority that had intimidated me for 20 years. This nonsense needs to stop immediately. Hello, Victoria. Which nonsense are you referring to? Don't be cute. Richard's career, the family business, everything we've built together, you're destroying it over what? A forgotten birthday? Together. Even now, even caught, she couldn't acknowledge that I'd built it. I'm not destroying anything, Victoria. I'm simply taking credit for my own work. Your work. Her voice sharpened. You're Richard's wife. Everything you did was as part of the Sterling family, for the Sterling business. You don't get to suddenly decide you're entitled to individual recognition. Sarah was taking notes, gesturing for me to keep Victoria talking. So you're saying that the Miller strategy was family property? I'm saying that wives don't get to hold their husbands' businesses hostage over marital grievances. And the Patterson turnaround? The Hoffman expansion? 20 years of strategic frameworks that generated millions in revenue, all family property? Margaret, you're embarrassing yourself. No one forced you to contribute to Richard's success. You chose to be supportive. You don't get to retroactively claim credit. There it was. 20 years of gaslighting, condensed into 2 sentences. I'd chosen to be supportive, therefore I'd forfeited the right to recognition. I'd contributed to Richard's success, therefore it was Richard's success. The logic was so circular, so perfectly designed to erase my contributions while making that erasure my fault, that I almost admired its twisted elegance. Victoria, I said, my voice steady with new certainty. I'm going to hang up now. If you have anything else to say, you can say it through lawyers. Margaret, don't you dare. I ended the call and looked at Sarah, who was grinning broadly. Perfect, she said. She just gave us everything we need for the countersuit. The Miller presentation, Richard's downfall, Friday morning, I sat in Miller Industries' conference room as Margaret Whitman, not Margaret Sterling. Across the table, CEO David Miller and CFO Jennifer Walsh waited for what they thought would be a routine project update from Sterling Consulting. Instead, they were about to witness the collapse of 20 years of carefully constructed fiction. Richard arrived 10 minutes late, looking haggard in a way that expensive suits couldn't hide. He'd brought 2 associates I didn't recognize, probably hoping that extra bodies would compensate for his lack of substance. David, Jennifer, he said, settling into his chair with false confidence. I'm excited to discuss the next phase of our strategic engagement. Excellent, David Miller replied. We're particularly interested in the supply chain optimization recommendations from your original analysis. Our board is eager to move forward with implementation. I watched Richard's face carefully. Supply chain optimization had been the cornerstone of my Miller strategy, a 60-page deep dive into regulatory compliance issues across 6 countries. It wasn't something you could fake or summarize. Of course, Richard said. As I outlined in our initial presentation, the key is understanding the regulatory landscape in each market. Yes, but can you elaborate on the specific compliance frameworks you recommended for Vietnam and Thailand? Our legal team needs more detail on the documentation requirements. Richard looked at his associates, who looked back with barely concealed panic. Could you be more specific about which documentation requirements? Jennifer Walsh opened a folder. Your original analysis mentioned Form VAT 301 modifications for textile imports and specialized customs clearance procedures for the Hanoi Economic Zone. Our operations team needs implementation timelines. I'd spent 3 days in Hanoi, working with customs officials to understand those exact procedures. It had been exhausting, technical work that required language skills and cultural sensitivity that Richard had never developed. Right? Richard said, stalling. Those specific requirements. Perhaps we should schedule a follow-up meeting where I can bring our full implementation team. Richard, David Miller's voice carried a note of concern. This was supposed to be the implementation meeting. You've had 3 months to develop these frameworks, and we have developed them. It's just that my lead researcher, Margaret, is temporarily unavailable due to health issues. Health issues. 20 years of marriage, and he was still making me disappear. Jennifer Walsh looked confused. I'm sorry, who is Margaret? My, my wife. She sometimes assists with research projects. The room fell silent. I could see David Miller processing this information, that Sterling Consulting's most comprehensive strategic analysis had been produced by Richard's wife, who was now having health issues that prevented the firm from delivering on their commitments. Mr. Sterling, Jennifer said carefully, are you telling us that your wife was the primary analyst on our account? No, of course not. I'm the lead strategist. Margaret just helps with background research. Background research. 47 interviews across 6 countries, condensed into background research. Then you should be able to answer basic questions about your own analysis, David Miller said, his voice cooling. Let's start simple. What's the current duty rate for synthetic textiles imported from Vietnam under the EFTA agreement? Richard looked like a deer caught in headlights. It was a specific detail from page 37 of my analysis, the kind of information that required specialized knowledge of trade agreements and tariff schedules. I'd need to verify the exact percentage, he said. It's 0.7%, Jennifer said. According to your own analysis. A detail that seems important enough for the lead strategist to remember. The meeting deteriorated rapidly from there. Question after question revealed the depth of Richard's ignorance about work he claimed to have produced. Supply chain logistics he couldn't explain. Regulatory requirements he'd never researched. Implementation timelines based on relationships he'd never built. 45 minutes later, David Miller stood up. Richard, I think we need to reassess our engagement with Sterling Consulting. It's becoming clear that there may be some confusion about who actually developed our strategic framework. Richard's face had gone pale. David, I can explain. I think you've explained enough. Jennifer Walsh was already closing her folders. We'll be in touch about next steps. After they left, Richard sat alone in the conference room for 20 minutes, staring at notes he couldn't read and strategies he'd never understood. I knew because Patricia texted me. Mr. Sterling is still in the Miller conference room. He looks like he's going to be sick. For 20 years, I'd protected him from moments like this. I'd made sure he never had to face a room full of people asking questions he couldn't answer about work he hadn't done. I'd been his invisible safety net, catching him every time his incompetence threatened to show. Not anymore. The aftermath Miller Industries calls. The call came Monday morning at 9:17 a.m. Jennifer Walsh, direct and professional. Ms. Whitman, this is Jennifer Walsh from Miller Industries. We need to talk. I was in Jonathan's office, finalizing paperwork for Whitman Consulting Group's official launch. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. Of course. What can I do for you? We've done some research over the weekend. It appears that you were the primary analyst behind the strategic framework that Sterling Consulting presented to us. Is that accurate? That's accurate. And you're no longer with Sterling Consulting? I'm launching my own firm. Whitman Consulting Group. A pause. Then, would you be available for a meeting this afternoon? David and I would like to discuss transitioning our engagement to your new firm. Transitioning our engagement. Not starting over, not renegotiating terms. Transitioning, as if they'd always known they were working with me rather than Richard. I'd be delighted. 3 hours later, I sat across from David Miller and Jennifer Walsh in the same conference room where Richard had humiliated himself. But this time, I wasn't invisible. Let's be direct, David said. We hired Sterling Consulting because of the quality of strategic thinking in your initial analysis. Now we discover that the person who did that thinking is no longer available through Sterling Consulting. Which puts us in an awkward position, Jennifer added. We've got a multi-million-dollar expansion plan based on your research, and Sterling Consulting clearly can't support implementation. I opened my laptop, pulling up the comprehensive Miller files I carried away from 20 years of invisible labor. I understand your concern. Here's what I'm proposing. Whitman Consulting Group takes over the Miller engagement immediately. You get continuity of strategic thinking, plus the advantage of working directly with the person who actually developed your framework. And Sterling Consulting? That's between you and them. But I can guarantee that any questions about supply chain optimization, regulatory compliance, or implementation timelines will get answers based on actual expertise rather than background research. David Miller smiled. When can you start? Today, if you need me to. Sitting in that conference room, signing contracts with my own name, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 20 years. Professional pride. Not the reflected glory of Richard's success, not the quiet satisfaction of invisible contribution, but the clean, clear recognition of work well done. This was what I'd been missing. This was what I'd given up for marriage. The domino effect, Sterling Consulting crumbles. The Miller Industries defection was just the beginning. By Thursday, Patricia was sending me updates that read like dispatches from a sinking ship. Patterson Manufacturing called. They want to know if Mrs. Sterling is available for consulting on their Latin American expansion. Hoffman Industries is reassessing their strategic partnerships. They asked specifically for your contact information. 3 more clients have requested meetings with senior management. Mr. Sterling keeps saying you're temporarily unavailable due to health issues. Health issues. Even as his world collapsed, Richard was still making me disappear. The final straw came Friday afternoon. Patricia's text was brief but devastating. Mr. Sterling just called an all-hands meeting. He's announcing temporary suspension of new client engagements. Temporary suspension. The business equivalent of a white flag. My phone rang within minutes. Richard, calling from what was probably the wreckage of his professional life. Margaret, we need to talk. No, Richard. We don't. The business is falling apart. Clients are leaving, employees are asking questions. Maybe you should have thought about that before throwing a party to celebrate my work without inviting me. I know I made mistakes. Mistakes? I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Richard, you built your entire career on my invisible labor. That's not a mistake. That's a deliberate strategy. Come back. I'll make it right. Full partnership, your name on everything. I already have my name on everything. It's called Whitman Consulting Group. The silence stretched between us. 20 years of marriage and stolen credit condensed into a phone call neither of us had ever expected to have. Margaret, he said finally, I know I don't deserve it, but I'm asking you to help me save the company. Why would I do that? Because we built it together. We built it together. Even now, even caught, even facing the complete collapse of his professional identity, Richard couldn't acknowledge that I'd built it while he'd taken credit. No, Richard, I built it. You just signed your name to it. I hung up and looked at Diana, who'd been listening from across Jonathan's conference room. How do you feel? She asked. Free, I said, and realized it was true. The counterattacked Victoria's desperation. Victoria Sterling had always preferred to fight her battles over expensive lunches in restaurants where raised voices would be socially unacceptable. So when she suggested meeting at Le Bernardin, the same restaurant where I'd spent my 50th birthday alone, I knew she was pulling out all the stops. She was already seated when I arrived, perfectly composed in a way that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. Chanel suit, Hermes bag, the kind of understated luxury that screamed old money and unshakable confidence. But her hands were trembling slightly as she lifted her water glass. Margaret, she said as I sat down. Thank you for coming. What do you want, Victoria? She flinched at my directness. 20 years of our relationship had been built on polite fiction and careful euphemisms. This new version of me, the one who asked direct questions and expected honest answers, clearly made her uncomfortable. I want to discuss the future of our family. We're not family anymore, Victoria. I'm filing for divorce. I know. That's why we need to talk. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Richard's falling apart. The business is hemorrhaging clients, employees are jumping ship, and he's not handling it well. Not handling it well. Such a delicate phrase for a complete psychological collapse. That's not my problem. It is if you have any feelings left for the man you married 20 years ago. I studied her face, looking for traces of the woman who'd welcomed me into the Sterling family with such calculated warmth. She was still beautiful at 73, still commanding in that effortless way that comes with generational wealth. But there were cracks now, lines of worry around her eyes, a tightness in her voice that suggested desperation barely held in check. The man I married 20 years ago was a lie, I said. Richard Sterling, strategic genius and successful businessman? That person never existed. I created him. Victoria's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something ugly underneath. You created nothing. You supported your husband's career, as wives do. You don't get to claim credit for Richard's success just because your marriage is ending. Richard's success was my success, Victoria. Every strategy, every client relationship, every innovative solution that built Sterling Consulting's reputation, that was my work. Your work as his wife, as part of our family. There it was again, the circular logic that had trapped me for 20 years. My contributions only counted when they benefited Richard, and they only benefited Richard because I was his wife, and being his wife meant forfeiting any claim to individual recognition. I have documentation, Victoria. 20 years of emails, strategy documents, client correspondence, all proving that I was the actual architect of Sterling Consulting's success. Her composure cracked further. You can't possibly think that would hold up in court. Actually, I can. My lawyer says it's one of the strongest intellectual property theft cases she's ever seen. Victoria set down her water glass with shaking hands. What do you want? I want you to stop calling me. I want Richard to sign the divorce papers. I want Sterling Consulting to acknowledge publicly that their strategic frameworks were developed by someone who's no longer with the company. And in return? In return, I don't pursue damages for 20 years of stolen intellectual property. The silence stretched between us, punctuated only by the quiet murmur of other diners who probably had no idea they were witnessing the end of a dynasty. Margaret, Victoria said finally, there's something you don't know. Something about Richard's intentions. She pulled out an envelope, sliding it across the table with the practiced discretion of someone accustomed to managing family secrets. Inside were printed emails, dozens of them, spanning several months. Richard's correspondence with his ex-girlfriend Rebecca, discussing divorce plans and asset protection strategies. She's become too integral to the business operations, read one message. Victoria thinks we should wait until after the Miller deal closes before making any moves. The Patterson account was worth $3.2 million last year, and that was mostly her work, read another. We need to figure out how to protect the client relationships if she leaves. Rebecca, I love you, but we have to be smart about this. Margaret's not just my wife. She's the brains behind the whole operation. If we move too fast, we could lose everything. I read through email after email, each one more damning than the last. Richard discussing divorce strategies with his ex-girlfriend while I worked 18-hour days on the Miller analysis. Victoria advising patients until they could secure the intellectual property. Both of them calculating how to discard me while keeping the work that had made them wealthy. Why are you showing me this? I asked, my voice steady despite the earthquake happening in my chest. Because I stopped him, Victoria said. When I found out about Rebecca, about his plans to leave you, I put an end to it. I protected you, Margaret. Protected you. Such an interesting way to describe keeping me trapped in a marriage so they could continue stealing my work. You protected the business, I said. You knew Richard couldn't function without me, so you made sure I stayed. I made sure our family stayed together. Your family, Victoria. Your business. Your legacy. I gathered the emails, evidence of 20 years of manipulation disguised as marriage. Thank you for these. They'll be very helpful in the divorce proceedings. Margaret, wait. But I was already standing, already walking away from the table where Victoria Sterling sat surrounded by the wreckage of her carefully constructed fiction. For 20 years, I'd believed in the narrative they'd created. Loving husband, supportive wife, successful family business built on partnership and mutual respect. Now I saw it clearly. It had been a prison disguised as a palace, with me as both the architect and the prisoner. The final confrontation in Richard's last stand. Richard was waiting outside my new office building when I left work that Thursday. 6 months had passed since I'd walked out of his birthday party, and he looked like he'd aged years in the interim. His suit was wrinkled, his usually immaculate hair needed cutting, and there were dark circles under his eyes that suggested he hadn't been sleeping well. Success had always made Richard look younger than his age. Failure was having the opposite effect. "We need to talk," he said, falling into step beside me as I walked toward my car. "No, we don't. About the emails Mom showed you. About Rebecca." I stopped walking and turned to face him. "What about them, Richard? I never sent them. Those messages you saw, I drafted them, but I never sent them. Mom found them in my deleted folder." Even now, even caught with documented evidence of his betrayal, Richard was trying to minimize the damage. "I never sent them," as if the thought wasn't as damaging as the action. "So you only plan to divorce me while stealing my work. That's supposed to make me feel better?" "I was scared," he said, running his hands through his unkempt hair. "You were becoming so essential to everything, and I felt redundant." Rebecca reached out when she heard about her success, and for a moment, I wondered what my life would look like if I wasn't constantly feeling inadequate next to my own wife. Inadequate next to his own wife. After 20 years of making me invisible, he was finally admitting that he'd known all along who was really responsible for his success. "You felt inadequate, so you decided to steal my work and abandon me?" I felt like I was disappearing in my own life. The words came out louder than he'd intended, drawing stares from other people on the sidewalk. "Everyone always talked about how brilliant you were, how strategic, how insightful. I was the CEO of my own company, and I felt like your assistant. You were my assistant, Richard. I was doing the work while you took the credit. I never asked you to. You never asked me to what? To build your career while sacrificing my own? To make you look brilliant while staying invisible? To work 18-hour days so you could play golf and take credit for my insights?" The fight went out of him suddenly, his shoulders sagging with defeat. "I know I screwed up. I know I don't deserve another chance. But Margaret, I loved you. I still love you." Love. Such a small word for such a complex emotion. Did he love me, or did he love what I could do for him? Did he miss his wife, or did he miss his unpaid strategic consultant? Love doesn't steal, Richard. Love doesn't erase. Love doesn't spend 20 years taking credit for someone else's brilliance. "I'll make it public," he said desperately. "I'll tell everyone that you were the real architect of Sterling Consulting's success. I'll put your name on everything, give you full credit. It's too late for that." "Why? Because you want to punish me?" I looked at this man I'd been married to for 20 years, this man who'd shared my bed and stolen my work and apparently planned to discard me once he'd extracted everything useful from my brain. "No, Richard. Because I don't need your permission to take credit for my own work anymore." The realization hit me as I said it. I wasn't leaving Richard to punish him. I was leaving him to save myself. After 50 years of life and 20 years of invisible labor, I was finally ready to be visible. "The divorce papers are with your lawyer," I said, walking toward my car. "Sign them. Margaret, please, sign them. Richard. Let me go." I drove away without looking back, but I could see him in my rearview mirror, standing alone on the sidewalk like a man who'd finally realized that the foundation of his entire life had been built by someone else. 18 months later, the empire rises. The business journal photographer wanted me to look powerful but approachable for the cover shoot. I settled for confident and direct, arms crossed in front of Whitman Consulting Group's new headquarters, a sleek building in River North that bore my name in brushed steel letters. "Rising Stars CEO named Business Leader of the Year." The headline would read. Underneath, in smaller type, "How Margaret Whitman Turned Corporate Shadows into Spotlight Success." Patricia knocked on my office door, holding a stack of messages and wearing the expression that meant either very good news or very bad news. "The Miller Industries contract expansion is final," she said. "They want us to handle their entire Asian Pacific strategy, $8.2 million over 3 years. Good news, then. Also," she continued, "Sophia Sterling is downstairs." She says she has a job interview at Morrison Strategic and wants to talk to you first. I looked out my office window at the Chicago skyline, thinking about second chances and family dynamics and the strange ways that success can reshape old relationships. Send her up. Sophia looked different than I remembered, less polished, more human. The designer clothes were gone, replaced by a conservative suit that looked like something from Nordstrom rather than Neiman Marcus. Her hair was shorter, her makeup more subtle, her entire demeanor less entitled and more uncertain. "Margaret," she said, perching on the edge of the visitor's chair. "Thank you for seeing me. What can I do for you?" I got a job offer. A real one, not family connections or mom's influence. Entry-level marketing coordinator at Morrison Strategic. That's wonderful. Congratulations. I wanted to ask. She twisted her hands together, a nervous gesture I'd never seen from the confident woman who'd once treated me like hired help. I know how things ended with our family, and I know I wasn't. I wasn't always fair to you. If you tell Jonathan not to hire me, he won't. I studied her face, looking for traces of the woman who'd watched her mother and brother take advantage of me for 20 years. What I saw instead was someone who'd lost everything and was trying to rebuild, not unlike myself 18 months ago. "Why should I help you?" "Because you taught me something," she said, straightening her spine with visible effort. "When Mom went to jail and Richard's business collapsed, I realized I'd been living in their shadow just like you were. The difference is, you did something about it, Sophia, in someone else's shadow." It had never occurred to me that Victoria Sterling's influence might have been as stifling for her daughter as it had been for her daughter-in-law. "What exactly would you be doing at Morrison Strategic?" "Basic marketing support. Social media coordination, event planning, client communications. Nothing strategic or high level." "And you'd be okay with that?" "Starting at the bottom, no family connections, no shortcuts?" She nodded firmly. "I want to earn something for myself." "Like you did." I opened my laptop and began typing. "I'm sending Jonathan an email about you." Sophia's face fell, probably expecting me to torpedo her chances out of justified revenge. "I'm going to tell him exactly who you are and what your family did to me," I continued. "And then I'm going to tell him that you came here today, asking for nothing but a chance to prove yourself, just like I once needed." Tears welled in her eyes. "Really?" "Really. But Sophia, don't waste this opportunity." "I won't," she promised, standing up. At the door, she paused. "You know, Richard kept your birthday card on his desk until they cleared out the office. The one you left the night you walked out. I think he finally understood what he lost." After she left, Patricia brought in coffee and the afternoon's client reports. Whitman Consulting Group had grown from a desperate escape plan to a $20 million business in 18 months. We had 37 employees, offices in 3 cities, and a reputation for strategic thinking that attracted clients from across the country. More importantly, we had my name on the door. My phone buzzed with a text from Diana. "Saw the Business Journal article. Drinks tonight to celebrate?" I smiled, looking out at the city's skyline that had become my domain rather than my prison. "Absolutely. We're celebrating visibility." Epilogue 2 years later. The charity gala was held in the ballroom of the Palmer House, the same hotel where Richard and I had held our wedding reception 22 years ago. But tonight, my name was on the invitation as the host, not as someone's wife. The Margaret Whitman Foundation for Women's Economic Empowerment, the banner read, hanging above tables filled with Chicago's business elite, many of whom had known me for years without ever really seeing me. I stood at the podium, looking out at an audience that included former clients, current competitors, and several familiar faces from my previous life. Richard wasn't there. He'd moved to Seattle after the divorce was finalized, trying to rebuild some version of a career that didn't depend on stolen intellectual property. Victoria was serving the second year of her sentence for financial fraud and embezzlement. But Sophia was there, sitting at the Morrison strategic table in a dress she'd probably saved for months to afford, looking proud and nervous and genuine in a way I'd never seen during our family years. 2 years ago, I began. I was invisible. Not physically, of course. I attended meetings, gave input, contributed to strategic decisions. But professionally, intellectually, I was invisible. My work was attributed to others. My insights were credited to someone else. My 20 years of expertise disappeared into the success of a man who'd learned to take bows for performances he'd never given. The audience was quiet, listening with the focused attention that comes when someone speaks uncomfortable truths about familiar dynamics. Tonight, we're launching a foundation dedicated to making women's economic contributions visible, to ensuring that the architects of success get credit for the buildings they design, to supporting women who want to step out of the shadows and into the spotlight of their own achievements. Applause filled the ballroom, genuine and sustained. In the audience, I could see faces of women who understood exactly what I was talking about: the invisible wives, the uncredited contributors, the shadow architects of other people's empires. The Margaret Whitman Foundation will provide seed funding for women starting their own businesses, legal support for intellectual property disputes, and professional development for women transitioning from invisible contributions to visible leadership. Because sometimes, I concluded, the best revenge isn't destroying your enemies. Sometimes it's building yourself up so high that they can't help but see you. After the formal program ended, people approached me with congratulations, business cards, and stories of their own invisible labor. Women who'd built their husbands' practices, developed their company strategies, managed their family's investments, all without credit, all without recognition, all without the simple acknowledgement that their work had value. Margaret, a familiar voice said behind me. I turned to find David Miller, CEO of Miller Industries, holding 2 glasses of champagne. Congratulations on the foundation. And on the Business Journal cover. We're proud to have been your first client. Thank you, David. How's the Southeast Asian expansion going? Exactly as you predicted. Your supply chain optimization framework saved us $12 million in the first year alone. He handed me one of the champagne glasses. To working with the real architect instead of the front man. We toasted, and I felt something I'd been missing for 50 years. The clean, clear satisfaction of recognition earned rather than stolen. Patricia appeared at my elbow. The foundation board wants to meet with you about the scholarship program. And there's a reporter from Forbes who'd like to interview you about women in consulting. Schedule both for next week, I said, then noticed her hesitation. What else? Richard called. He wanted to congratulate you on the foundation launch. I considered this information, thinking about the man who'd shared my life for 20 years and my work for longer than that. What did you tell him? That you were busy building your own empire. I smiled, looking around the ballroom filled with people celebrating not just my success, but the principle that success should be visible, credited, and owned by the people who actually create it. Perfect response, I said. Later that night, alone in my penthouse apartment overlooking Lake Michigan, I opened my laptop and began writing. Dear women in the shadows, you know who you are. You're the strategic mind behind your husband's business success. You're the uncredited co-author of your colleagues' breakthrough research. You're the invisible architect of your family's financial security. You've been told that recognition is less important than impact, that credit is less valuable than contribution, that visibility is less meaningful than results. You've been told wrong. Your work has value. Your insights have worth. Your contributions deserve recognition. And you deserve to step out of the shadows and into the light of your own success. It's never too late to become visible. It's never too late to claim credit for your own brilliance. It's never too late to build something with your name on it. The Margaret Whitman Foundation exists to help you make that transition. From invisible to visible. From shadow to spotlight. From someone else's success story to your own. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't about destroying your enemies. Sometimes it's about building yourself up so high that they can't help but see you, even if they're looking up from rock bottom. And sometimes, the greatest gift you can give yourself is the power to write your own story. Visibly yours, Margaret Whitman CEO, Whitman Consulting Group founder, the Margaret Whitman Foundation. I saved the document and closed the laptop. Outside my windows, Chicago glittered in the darkness, a city full of shadows and light, invisible contributions, invisible success. Tomorrow, I would continue building my empire, not by tearing others down, but by lifting myself and other women up. Tonight, I would simply enjoy the view from the top of a mountain I'd built with my own hands. bearing my own name, casting my own shadow in the spotlight I finally claimed. The invisible woman had become impossible to ignore,